Dan Russo is the editor of the Catholic Messenger. Dan, thanks for coming on the Catholic Morning Show.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So we wanted to talk today about, so in the Diocese of Davenport, Bishop Emeritus Franklin was the seventh bishop of the Diocese of Davenport, and he has recently passed away, Bishop Emeritus William Franklin, I should say. And the funeral had came up, and this gave a moment to pause and reflect about his influence on the diocese. So if you don't mind, share with us maybe some of our listeners who might not know who was the bishop, and what were some of the thoughts that came about due to the occasion of his funeral.
Well, the bishop was born in 1930. He came from an Irish Catholic family of 7 children, and it was a working-class family in the middle of the Great Depression was when he entered the world. And then he was working in a machine shop in Cedar Rapids when he somebody suggested to him that he should become a priest. And after that, he was off and running, and he was ordained in the Archdiocese of Dubuque. Somebody there must have saw something in him because he became an auxiliary bishop there first, and then was ordained to be the head of the Davenport Diocese in the 1990s. And he served for 12 years until 2006, 1994 to 2006. During his time there, he had some leadership styles that were a little bit different. He believed in subsidiarity, which is the Catholic principle that things should be taken care of at the lowest level first, if possible, and then go up from there. And back then, that was a little bit challenging because Pope John Paul II was the Pope at the time, and he was a very, forceful personality. So some people liked his leadership style, some people didn't. And then, of course, he had to deal with the fallout from the clergy sex abuse crisis at the time, and there was also some consolidations of parishes that he dealt with. But through it all, he kind of maintained his faith, and he really did love being a priest, and he had a sense of humor, and people talked about that at the funeral. It was kind of nice to see his witness because there were seminarians there serving on the altar at the Mass, and, one of them talked to me, and he said that, he'd like to be a priest, kind of like Bishop Franklin, that was willing to get out there and be with the people. Even in the midst of that crisis, he was out there trying to engage with people, and he met with victims at the time, so he wasn't the type that was just sitting in his office. He was out there trying to be a pastoral presence, I would say.
Well, and as the sort of demonstration of this, for instance, Bishop Robert Gruss of the Diocese of Saginaw, Michigan, was ordained by Bishop Franklin as a priest, and he did the homily. So what is that sort of legacy shown by, instances like that?
Well, yeah, I think if you look at the funeral, there were 5 bishops that showed up, and all of them had a connection to him somehow. And when you're talking about Bishop Gruss, I think that what he said in this homily was that there was a lot about Bishop Franklin. He knew the weight of his crozier, is what he said, and he knew the cost of leadership and hidden sacrifices. But at the same time, he loved being a bishop. And Bishop Gruss was a pilot before, a private pilot, not an airline pilot, but he was a commercial private pilot before becoming a priest. He heard his calling late in life, and then through his connections, he was ordained a priest by Bishop Franklin. And Bishop Franklin kind of brought him in and saw leadership qualities in Bishop Gruss and kind of helped him develop as a clergyman to the point where he is now leading a diocese. So I think it says something about the mentorship that he had for some of these other bishops, that they would show up at the funeral and in that case do the homily. So.
Well, and when we have things like funerals for bishops, of course, an occasion for an entire diocese to reflect not only on leadership, but what that's meant for the history of the diocese, but also to remember, of course, that bishops, like priests, like any religious, are also very human. So you have the story about how he was Uncle Bill to his nieces and nephews, and how even that sort of human element got to come out as well.
Yeah, like when I went to the funeral, there were some people that were sad and somber, but at the back of the cathedral before the Mass, a bunch of people were kind of laughing, and I went over to them, and it turned out it was 2 of his nieces and a couple of their husbands, and they were just making a few observations about Uncle Bill, is what they called him. And he had a lot of family in Cedar Rapids, so he would go back there and go to family gatherings, and he liked to make jokes. And there was one time where he was baptizing one of his niece's sons, and I guess the man was named, or the baby was named Randy. You know, not a common saint name, but he made a joke and said, "Hey, I bet you there's a Saint Randy up there somewhere." So he was always hanging out with his family when he wasn't working, and they kind of knew him as not just a priest, but as just this older uncle that just always had a smile and was ready to be there and be part of their lives, I guess.
Well, when it comes to, thinking about his life, not only as a bishop and what that meant, particularly in the 90s and the early 2000s, but to go back to being born in 1930, small-town Iowa, Parnell, one of 7 children in an Irish Catholic family. What does his life sort of represent about the way that Catholicism, the roots of Catholicism in the Davenport Diocese, and its ever sort of evolving and changing makeup as we, of course, proceed into the future? How is it that his life, as it were, is not only a beacon of leadership, but even just in his life as a Catholic, demonstrates where Catholics in Davenport have come from and where they're going?
Well, just like a lot of the dioceses in the state, we're kind of a frontier diocese in the beginning where, a bunch of immigrants and others came across the Midwest and settled. They made, churches out of logs and started very simply. And I think the town he came from was once called Little Ireland, the small town of Parnell, because there were so many Irish immigrants there. And it just goes to show how the Holy Spirit can lead somebody from simple beginnings to the height of the church. And we're seeing that now in Davenport. We have a lot of different, established families and groups, but we also have a lot of immigrant groups coming in now. We have a big population from Mexico. There's also Asian Catholics from Vietnam and other places. And it's kind of like Bishop Franklin was buried in the Sacred Heart Cathedral, which was built on a place called Cork Hill, which was an Irish Catholic immigrant neighborhood at one point, and it's a beautiful cathedral that they built, even though they were not very rich at the time. And to see him be buried in there, and then to see like the Vietnamese there were some Vietnamese Catholics that came, there were some Hispanic Catholics that came, and it's the same story kind of repeating itself, but you never know how the Holy Spirit's going to work in whatever culture or family that it comes into. And I think it just shows that there are sort of similarities. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So I think like Bishop Franklin, and I think I stole that one from Mark Twain, so don't quote me on that.
Right.
But so Bishop Franklin pretty much he came from that background, and God led him in a certain direction. And I think the same thing's happening again. We have tough times in the church, but there's a renewal too. And so if you look at some of these communities that are in Davenport now, they're bringing new life into the church, and just like what the Irish did way back when in the 19th century and early 20th century.
Well, and finally, before we let you go, as an editor and reporter for a Catholic newspaper, there's a certain rhythm maybe that Catholic newspapers have, maybe a bit different than sort of secular newspapers. But of course, something like the passing on of a bishop, obviously that's going to keep happening throughout time. But as someone who is, responsible for the news and letting people know the stories that matter in a diocese, what was it like to cover this event? I'm assuming this is your first bishop's funeral since coming to Davenport. I just wonder what it was like for you and the Catholic Messenger to be a part of this. This happening.
Well, I would say it's kind of like being part of a sports team in a way, because we have a staff of 5 people, and everybody on the staff had to do something. I mean, we had a guy who does our video. He was up in the choir loft. We even had some retired employees come back and help us with some things. And so, you kind of have to coordinate, and it was unique to see this sort of thing because there's large processions. The music was pretty amazing. But we had to make sure that, like, just that picture we got with all the bishops together, it took some logistical effort by our staff to make sure just to get that, because everybody wants to dress in different places. And so, behind the scenes, it was kind of interesting. And I got to say thank you to all the Catholic Messenger staff that helped and the retired, and even some of the liturgists and people that put that together. It's amazing to see. I'm not going to compare it to, like, Broadway, because it's more, I guess, more spiritual than that. but it does take a lot of planning and teamwork to make an event like that happen. So,
absolutely,
yeah, it was pretty amazing.
Well, we'd be remiss to say if we forgot. So make sure, folks, to pray for the repose of the soul of Bishop Emeritus William Franklin, but for the funeral and what it meant for the Diocese of Davenport, we want to say thank you to Dan Russo, editor of the Catholic Messenger. Dan, thank you for coming on the Catholic Morning Show.
Thank you.